getting a bunch of folks who are all trying to solve the same problems on one call and just diving into stuff together that I just really do love. So, as always, it means so much to me that you took some time to answer these questions, to block off part of your day to jump in and hear some of what we have to share. I'm super excited about it, and I just want to say a big thank you and welcome to my co-hosts this week. Sasha and Chris from the Sparkbox team are here, and so say hello to them there. You should be able to see them on screen. They'll be really active in the chat. They'll be active in the Fig Jam. If you have any problems at all, you can always just DM one of the two of them in the Zoom chat, and we'll make sure we address whatever challenges you're facing. But thank you, Sasha, for being here. Thank you, Chris. It means a lot. Appreciate you taking some time out of your days too. Let's get going here. So I wanted to give the Type A folks a little agenda, just so you know what's coming. So we've got this kind of broken up into really two big sections. The welcome's going to be real quick here. I'm going to share some of the things that I've been learning alongside many of you as members of the question community. I'm going to be sharing some of the things that I've learned. That's a section of the presentation called Wisdom from the Trees, and I'll explain why I called it that in a moment. And then we'll spend a few minutes after that unpacking the data, the questions that you answered in order to register. We've done some analysis on that, so we'll reveal that. We'll kind of dig into it together, and then we'll just have some conversation. You know, we've got a good half of this time set aside just to dive into this stuff and try to understand some of the nuance of this work, which, as you know, there's a lot. So that's our high level agenda for the day. Let me just cover a couple really quick things. In order for this to be helpful for folks, you know, we wanted to leave the Zoom chat open. We wanted to leave that Fig Jam open. So that means, of course, that we have to be incredibly respectful with every decision we make in those opportunities to connect. So please, 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 just be considerate and be respectful. It means the world to us that you've taken time out of your day to be here, but I just want this to be a really inviting and safe environment for everybody. So that's what we're really after here. The way I think about this is that everybody here has something to teach me. And I think if we all come to this event with that same mentality, that's going to put us in a really good frame of mind for a healthy conversation. If you do have any issues at all, please, please just jump into the Zoom chat and you can send a direct message to Sasha or to Chris, and we'll make sure we pause everything and address it right away, okay? But please just be kind. Please be respectful. Thank you so much for being that way. Okay, there's a lot of ways for you to participate today. So the Fig Jam is open, the Zoom chat is open. We're going to leave that chat going throughout the day. So I've got a section where I'm going to share a lot of the things that I'm learning. But while I'm doing that, you all can have a conversation in there. If you want to take some notes, you can do that in the Fig Jam. We're going to be trying to move everything we can into that Fig Jam file. So if you're comfortable in there, I'll show you here in just a moment, like how to kind of get around in there. But I think that's going to be a great place for us to capture things. And then when we get to the live discussion part of the day, I would love for you, if you'd like to come on screen and share a perspective, which would mean the world to me, if you would turn your camera on, and then you can raise your hand using the Zoom and whatever it's called, you know, in Zoom, you can click to raise your hand, and that'll sort of bring you to the front of the audience there, and then we'll know that you're interested in sharing. So that's kind of the process that we'll use there. I hate to exclude folks who don't have a camera, but I do think for the sake of the conversation, we'd love to see your face if you want to jump on and share. If you don't have that, please just use the Zoom chat or jump into the Fig Jam, and you can add notes and comments in that way, okay? All right, I've mentioned Fig Jam a few times now. That link is in the chat. And folks, if you can't find it, I see Chris just posted. Thank you, Chris. But we're going to do a lot in there. So let me show you just very quickly. I'll give you just a little rundown of what's going on here. So you can add up at the top. You can add some information about yourself. I can see a lot of you doing that now. That's great. If you want to link to maybe your LinkedIn profile or something, that would be awesome. So we can all get connected to each other. There's a section here called Wisdom from the Trees, which we'll use to kind of take notes throughout the presentation that I'll give here in a moment. If you have questions that come up while we're going through that presentation, there's a spot just to the right of that for you to drop a sticky note. You can add anything you want there as a question, and we'll do our best to try and kind of categorize those and get them answered for you. And then The section down below called the answers is here. And this is where we will unpack that data and kind of look into the way that you all answered questions for us. Um, while we go through this, just so that you know, there is also a spot down below where you can add some resources. I've put a bunch of things in that are stuff that I've been referencing and reading and thinking about. But if you have something that comes to mind as we're going through any of this and you want to share a link to an article or a talk or a book, there's a spot there to do that. We have a couple announcements. We'll walk through those at the very end. But otherwise, if you have feedback on the actual format or the presentation or any of what we're doing here today, we're totally open to that. So there's a spot over here for you to drop a sticky note and just tell us how we could be better. We would love that. Otherwise, that's really kind of it. There's some instructions here on how to use FigJam if it's not a super familiar tool to you. The two big things you need to know are sticky notes, and you can grab those right from the bottom down here. And then the other one that's super helpful is this emotes and stamps. So I'll just show you quickly. If you just press the E key, it pops up this little thing and you can choose either an emotion or a stamp. And the stamp is nice because you can use that to like vote for something. And you'll get a couple opportunities to do that a little later. So that's really it. I'm going to trust that my team is here and helping take care of you all in the chat and in the FigJam. And I think it's time for us to pop back over and just kind of get going on this material. Let me make sure we got everything going here. Okay, everybody's cool. So good to see you all. I'm excited about this. Thank you for being here. Okay, so let's actually jump in. So I titled this Wisdom from the Trees. And I know that a lot of you are wondering why the trees. We thought we were talking about design systems, right? Well, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because I've been telling this story about redwood trees probably for over a decade at this point. But you're going to see a bunch of illustrations of redwood trees throughout this whole presentation. So I thought it would make sense to kind of explain why the heck those are in here. The short story, the very short version of this, is that I had an opportunity to go visit Muir Woods just outside of San Francisco 10, 12 years ago now. And that trip was really sort of a monumental moment for me. I learned on that trip that these massive trees, taller than the Statue of Liberty, literally can't stand on their own. Underneath the surface, they're all connected, and the roots really don't go that deep, but they actually hold each other up. And that, I think, for me, that moment of sort of like being in the presence of these trees and also learning this about them was a pivotal moment in my life. And I think about that all the time. And I honestly believe this is a big statement, but I honestly believe this, that almost everything that I've done since then has been influenced in some way by that moment. It really was a big, impactful moment for me. And the most recent incarnation of that influence is something that I call the question. This has been going on for just over a year now. And it's kind of, honestly, it's kind of hard to explain. I call it a collaborative learning experiment. And the way that it works, each episode of the question runs over the course of 1 week, and it culminates in a live show, kind of like this, on a Thursday or a Friday. Here's the schedule. You can see this on your screen now. So on Monday morning, we email out a question or two, and it's about a very specific niche topic in design systems. We share that around social. And basically, folks get about 48 hours to answer that question. And then on Wednesday at noon, we close that question down, and we send an invite to a deep dive either on Thursday or Friday. Wednesday evening, I sit right here at this desk. I usually pour a little bit of scotch, and I do my best to dive into all of the data that you all share with me every week, all of your experiences, your expertise, and it's incredibly insightful. So I spend a couple hours every night on Wednesday just really diving into that data and trying to understand what we could learn together. Out of that, I build a FigJam file, very similar to the one that we're using today. And then on Thursday or Friday, we all get on a Zoom call just like this one, and we just dive in. And it's super fun. It's super interesting. A ton of the folks that are here have participated at one point or another. So if you're a question regular, you can tell everybody in the chat that they should go sign up, okay? It's incredible. I've learned a ton through this. And to date, this community has grown from just a few folks to actually over 800 people. We've recorded almost 50 episodes. We're at, I think, 48 now. And every single one of those is covering a really specific design system concern. It is so unique and so powerful. And I wanted to give you this context because a large part of what I'm going to share with you today are things that I've learned from the question and from two other things. And so the question's been a big influence in my life for the last year. The other two are here. So our work at Sparkbox covers everything you need to build digital products more systematically. That's really what we do. And we've worked on some of the largest design systems out there, and we thrive, truly we do thrive on coming alongside internal teams to tackle those challenges together. I learn from my team and our clients every day doing this work. So it is also hugely influential in my thinking. And as you just heard, the question is a constant input for me. I'm surrounded by folks, many of you, who are trying to tackle the same problems, and they're just so generous with their experience and their knowledge. And I learn from this design system community every week. And then finally, I've made it a habit to draw a lot of insight from a variety of books and articles and talks. I'm basically just always trying to kind of experiment with the insights that I gather, and I share all that with the folks that I coach through their design system careers. And every week I'm learning from those folks as well. So I feel really fortunate that I have all of this input, right? All these sources of folks who are like willing to share and be so generous with their knowledge. My point here is that each of you are a tree, right? You are all the trees. And I'm lucky. I feel really fortunate because that means that we're all in the same forest. I've got these illustrations of redwoods throughout this deck because I want to remind each of us to stay in learning mode. I want to remind myself and I want to remind you that everybody here has something to teach us. That all makes sense? Good? Excellent. I see some nods. Thank you. Okay, let's go. So the whole premise for today is that a lot of organizations are not clearly seeing the value they hoped for from their design system programs. And when I stepped back to prepare for this, I was really thinking about like what causes that. And the way that I see it, there are two possible reasons for this. The first is we made the wrong thing, right? Like if you don't build something valuable for your users, it's probably not going to show a ton of value. So this one may be a little bit obvious. And the second thing is we made the right thing, but there's some other stuff that's getting in the way. Other things are going on, right? Politics, culture, competing priorities. There's a long list. So for the next few minutes, I'd love to dive into these two ideas. One, that we made the wrong thing, and how could we resolve that? And one, that we made the right thing, but there's just this other stuff we got to work through too. So let's start with we made the wrong thing. Now, in order to unpack this, I want to go way back to the very beginning of your design system. Let's ask ourselves, how should we start a system? And I want to share some of what I learned in episode 2 of the question. For this episode, we asked, which approach and why would you take with a brand new design system? And the two options we gave were inside out, and by that we meant starting with foundations, things like color and type, and maybe very atomic level, small, components, or outside in, starting with much larger patterns in the product experience. Now, I want to show you what I learned in this, but before I do that, I actually want to invite you all into the Fig Jam with me. There is a section up here in the top, sort of top left-ish, where you can actually cast a vote for me. I'd love to see what you think. If you were starting over with your system, you can come in here, you can drag a sticky up, drop it on one side or the other. And I see a couple folks starting to now. Thank you. Wondering if, yeah, there we go. Thank you, everybody. So I'll give just a moment here while folks are dropping a sticky. Just put your name in there. And then pick a side, drop it in. I love this. Okay. I'm going to zoom out a bit while you all answer. Okay. Starting to get a sense for maybe a little bit more weight on the left here. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to come back to this, but while you all are answering, let me just share what we learned when we asked this of a huge group of folks in the question community. So we asked, how would you choose to start, inside out or outside in? And overwhelmingly, we saw folks respond with this idea of inside out as the starting point. I mean, it was, I think it was 60, it's almost 70% is what we saw. And these folks would talk in their answers about focusing on principles and guidelines and color and type and spacing and all those other foundational, fundamental pieces. But I'll tell you that we also had some strong opinions in the other way, and in fact, in all directions here. So let me share a little bit about what I heard. This person said, the foundational bits are a force multiplier. It's worth the investment to nail those before we do anything else. Otherwise, it's akin to building a house on quicksand. Okay, I remember reading this and thinking, yeah, I don't want to put my house there, right? Like, so yeah, we need these foundational bits, right? And here's another one. This person had a different perspective. They said design systems have gotten to the point that we know what must go in them. This leads to overbuilt systems with parts that aren't often used. A more iterative approach to building only what teams actually need means less maintenance down the road. Okay, well, that's important too, right? I get that. I know I've seen a lot of systems that have so much stuff in them that it doesn't really get used, right? Okay, so we've got these compelling arguments on both sides. And one thing that's really amazing about you all when you answer these questions is you're so good at articulating why you believe a certain thing. So I appreciate that about all the answers we get. But my favorite response by far to this question was actually this one. This is a trick question. And I think, it wasn't a trick question intentionally, but when I kind of moved through the answers and tried to understand this, I think I sort of landed on maybe agreeing with this person. And we do get a lot of this sort of respectful sass in the comments, which I love. We try not to take ourselves too seriously. So during the deep dive for this week, we started to map out the pros and the cons of each approach. And we went through all the results that people shared, and we identified the kinds of advantages that apply to each. So here's what we heard, right? This is sort of our collaborative synthesis. The inside out approach has some advantages. It's high impact for low effort. And I think what we meant by that is things that are at this sort of like low level, like the foundational level, are things that exist throughout all of your products, things like colors and type and all of that basic stuff. So when you do a little bit of work to sort of create more cohesion there, it can have a big impact. And that's actually you're not having to go recreate all of these interfaces, with complex components and stuff. So there's a benefit there for sure. I think talking about the foundational work is actually something that is easy for a leader who's not maybe necessarily living in Figma or in React or whatever to understand. They get it, right? We can describe them. We can use analogies like Legos and things like this to say, if we have all these pieces, we can construct things. So it's an easy pitch. Also, these, depending on how you build them, these can be pretty easy for product teams to use, actually. Give folks some CSS variables and they can just include those and start using them without a ton of, headache. And then they definitely have this advantage of enabling a more systematic way of thinking, right? Because we're looking at them as the little bits and pieces that you can use to construct larger things. It sort of forces you into this systematic way of thinking. So I love Inside Out for these ideas, for these reasons. Outside In had some other advantages though, where Inside Out was about like focusing on these little foundational pieces. Outside In is saying, hey, you know what? Let's go solve something substantial right away. Let's get out of the gate solving something complicated, something that maybe some product teams are struggling to figure out. So that's interesting. They're easier to tie to product roadmaps. And I think this one in the third bullet here, meeting subscribers where they are, kind of go together. If you think about folks who are, like product managers on teams that might use your system, I'm guessing they probably don't have a lot of stuff in their roadmap that is like, change all of my colors, right? They're thinking about bigger things, right? They're thinking about features. They're thinking about much larger, sort of more composed experiences. So Starting from the outside in is just a more obvious way for a product manager to be like, yeah, we got some work on a roadmap that needs that, so we'll jump on. And then the thing that I think stood out to me the most about outside in is this idea that you build only what you need. Whereas on the inside out, you might start to let that scope creep a bit. Outside in is kind of like we're just taking the things we know are needed and refactoring those down into the smallest pieces and parts. So lots of advantages here. On the risks side, I mentioned this a moment ago, but I think the inside out has this tendency for easy scope creep. I've worked with a lot of folks who, when they go to do this inside out approach, they start looking at colors and then they start expanding that to think, well, we might need these colors in between these and type sizes. We might need all of these others. And, it very easily can kind of balloon into just a whole bunch of stuff that actually won't really ever get used. So that's a risk here, I think. Trying to build foundations outside of the context of a larger experience is also a risk. You're making some guesses about what teams might need if you're not looking at the larger experiences. And a lot of the folks felt this could create too much rigidity. Outside in, there were some other risks, right? Maybe it creates more technical debt. And I think this goes with the second point where once you've got a component in place, it's hard to kind of make space in the roadmap to go back and redo it. Those teams are not wanting to redo the same stuff over and over again. So if you start outside in and then you realize you have to refactor down the road and they need to redo that work, they're not going to be super happy about that. And then another risk, that final one is without the foundations, it's actually hard to really scale this work, right? I mean, the foundations are what give us the ability to kind of create the composition and know and trust that there's a sort of solidness to the work we're doing. So lots of advantages, lots of risks. And I don't feel like looking at these lists, they didn't give me a clear answer, But that's what I was hoping for from this session was tell me which one we should do, Now, there were a few other responses in this episode where the people just straight up refused to answer. And they said things kind of like this. In real life, we vacillate between looking inward and looking outward. I was just like, whoa, I didn't know the Buddha was answering our questions, right? I mean, it got super spiritual on us. But it really did get me thinking that I had posed the question in a way that really truly put these two approaches against each other. I had asked the community to choose one or the other. And at the same time, I was actually working my way through this phenomenal book. In fact, I've been reading this book for maybe a year and a half, 2 years now. I'm still processing it. I'm still digesting it. It is a deep well of knowledge. And that book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if this is something that y'all are familiar with, but it's one of my favorite pieces of writing. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a Potawatomi botanist. She's an author. She's a director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at the State University of New York College. And she grew up with a real love and curiosity and respect for plants. And she just sort of grew up in the woods, just really sort of a childhood where she was permitted and expected to just go out into nature. And in this book, she's telling the story. She tells many stories, but the section I'd like to focus on here is that she tells the story of her first college admissions interview, where she came face to face with a very different approach to the study of plants. Here's what she said. In moving from a childhood in the woods to the university, I had unknowingly shifted between worldviews, from a natural history of experience in which I knew plants as teachers and companions, to whom I was linked with mutual responsibility, into the realm of science. The questions scientists raised were not who are you, but what is it? No one asked the plants, what can you tell us? The primary question was, how does it work? So I'm reading this about her experience, and at the same time, I'm thinking about the responses that we had just gathered in the question. And I realized that these questions she calls out, who are you versus what is it, actually mapped to the two approaches I had offered members of the question community. I had asked inside out versus outside in. without really understanding that I was forcing people to choose between two very necessary approaches. The answers people shared with me in the question helped me to realize that it's not enough to know what. We also have to ask why. An inside out approach helps us understand what something is or how it works. But an outside in approach helps us understand why something is the way it is. I've long been a fan of this guy named Russell Ackoff. He was a professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He was sort of like one of the founding fathers and a pioneer in the field of systems thinking. And around this time, I was also on this kick of just watching all of these old lectures of his on YouTube. And there's one where he explains this kind of the same concept, but it's applied to classic systems thinking. And it's from a lecture he has about the difference between analysis and synthesis. And in that lecture, he told a really quick story that I'd like to try my best to recount for you here. He said, "How do you explain why the engine is in the front of a car?" Let me tell you why. The engine replaced the horse, which used to be in the front of the carriage. What we call a car today was first referred to as a horseless carriage. That's why the engine is located in the front of a car. And you could not have figured this out by taking the car apart. He's so right. No amount of disassembly would have given us any clue that the engine's in the front because the predecessor to the car was a horse-drawn carriage. You have to look at the car's place in history to understand this. You actually have to look outside the car itself. And he goes on to show that analysis and synthesis have almost opposite processes. In analysis, we begin by taking something apart. In synthesis, we ask, what is this a part of? In analysis, we continue by understanding the function of those individual parts. In synthesis, we continue by understanding the behavior of the containing whole. In analysis, we continue by assembling the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. And in synthesis, we disassemble the meaning of the whole into the meaning of the parts. And these are completely opposite processes. Oops, sorry, my deck reset. These are completely opposite processes. Analysis helps us to understand what something is, and synthesis really is about helping us understand why it is that way. And it was connecting these dots that made it so clear that for those of us doing design system work, we need both, right? And this crystallized my thinking around design system processes so that we now lead two lines of effort with almost all of our clients at Sparkbox. One is very tactical. It's an analysis of what our clients have. We take those things apart. We try to understand how they work, and then we help them design and build more stuff. But the other is a much more strategic synthesis of why they have what they have. In order to do that synthesis, we have to recognize that a design system lives inside a larger system. That larger system is the organization. So the kinds of questions we ask to understand the why of a system are questions that focus outside the design system itself. Here we're asking things like, tell me about the structure of your organization. How would you describe the culture of your company? Describe the landscape of products your company offers. And how is your success measured by the rest of the organization? This is necessary because it helps us to understand why an organization has, or honestly, why they even need a design system. And no amount of digging into their assets or coded component libraries can answer that for us. That's like taking a car apart to understand why the engine is in the front. So if you're finding that maybe you've built the wrong thing, perhaps it's because you haven't found a balance between the tactical and the strategic. I want to share a few things I took away from another episode of the question. This was episode 35, and we asked the community this. Overall, do you feel your design system team is doing the right work? And then we asked, what should your top priority be? And what are you working on that you shouldn't be working on? So we unpacked this data together, and we learned that Even the folks who answered yes, and you can see a lot of folks felt like they're working on the right thing, is over 60%. They still, as we dug into the data, we saw that they still find that a struggle for some reason to stay focused on the right things. And over 25% of people who responded stated clearly, without a doubt, that they don't feel they're working on the right stuff. So, of course, that's a little concerning. But the more we dug in, the more folks started to share about the nuances they're really struggling with. Here's what one community member shared that really stood out to me. He said, there is a focus on adding more components to the system. This is driven by an oversimplified view of the value the design system brings from our leadership team. Our current component coverage covers most of our use cases. Adding new components now has diminishing returns. We should have a greater focus on adoption. The idea that leadership has an oversimplified view of the value a design system brings really rang true for me and for everybody in attendance. So in preparation for the deep dive, I kind of sketched this little diagram out. This is just a screenshot from that collaborative FigJam file. And I was trying to kind of articulate that in a way that would make sense. I was trying to express that the really smart design system teams are trying so very hard to focus on the right things, but leadership often sees the goal of a design system as offering all the things. And this, I mean, this is just such a struggle. It creates so much tension. The truth is, design systems really thrive in the overlap between products, not in giving product teams assets to cover every possible need they might have. And this misunderstanding creates a lot of competing tension that make it really hard to be surgical with your prioritization. The more I dug into this, the more I realized the connection to the conversation around synthesis and analysis to strategic and tactical thinking. And that led me to this diagram. On the y-axis, I have two types of impact. I've got strategic impact here at the top. That's impact through culture, like maybe aligning what people value and adjusting maybe their incentives in some way. Now, by strategic, I don't mean just a list of design principles. Of course, those are important, but I think they live somewhere maybe in the middle or just above the middle of the y-axis. I'm thinking of the ways you encourage and reward the behaviors of individuals or teams that live out those principles. And that's because culture is driven by what individuals believe, and it's made visible by the decisions they make when things are hard. The things at the top of this axis are the ways you slowly help create alignment in what individuals believe. Those are things like your incentive structure and your decision-making frameworks, the things that help people find solutions that align with the goals of the system. On the bottom of this axis, I have this idea of tactical impact. And by tactical, I mean the stuff that product or feature teams can directly take and use in their work. There's a lot of this, right? This is basically most of what you read about in terms of design systems these days is how to design and build and distribute this stuff. It's CSS custom properties, it's the layout system you offer, it's tokens and components and all of that stuff, all the stuff we give people. On the x-axis of this diagram, I'm trying to represent every digital interface that your organization creates. So out on the far left, I have the pieces of the interaction patterns that are common to all products. So this would be things like your brand colors or your very low-level components. This is where your buttons and your type stacks and your form inputs live, right? And then out on the far right, I have ones that are hyper-specific to one product. So this might be like a color swatch selector that's used in some far-reaching corner of an e-com website somewhere. And when you put all this together, you can see some really interesting stuff. Let me show you kind of what I mean. I've labeled the top left quadrant inefficient cohesion. That's because this is a space where there's alignment of values. We're at the top here, right? So we have a strong culture, but there aren't tactical assets. We're on the top, right? So we've avoided the tactical here. So while the output of organizations can be really good here, there's just a lot of inefficiency because they are all solving the common problems for themselves. And if you find yourself operating here, a great next step is to begin to build out some of the assets that cover the most common interface patterns across your products. And that takes us down into the bottom left quadrant. I've labeled this one efficient cohesion. Here, the design system team has identified the common patterns and solved for those with assets that can be reused across the org. This is the baseline for creating some impact. And many system programs honestly never grow beyond this. That's, I don't know, that's not necessarily a problem, but without the cultural guidance provided at the top of the axis and without assets to solve every product specific challenge, the product teams often will feel like they're constrained by the system instead of enabled by it. So if you find yourself primarily operating here, that's great, but it's time to start working into the top right quadrant as well. But before we go there, let's take a look at the bottom right. I've labeled this one add more components. And that's because in order to reach into those product specific interaction patterns out on the far right, but without a more strategic approach, that cultural impact, you have to just make everything an asset. In an extreme version of this world, the design system would have every component needed by every product, which we all know is not possible, right? It's not feasible. This is often, unfortunately, what leadership expects of a design system, unless you're very intentional to correct that assumption. So if you find yourself operating here, it's actually time to start cutting back on what your system offers. And with the time you save by not having to maintain so much of that stuff, you can start working on incentives and decision making, the stuff that will support the principles of your system. In the top right, I've labeled future-proof and far-reaching. This is where the most impactful system work happens. This is the cultural alignment stuff. This is, this is the hard stuff, right? This is the tasks here that result in individuals throughout the organization feeling really confident that they're making decisions that align every day. It's actually really empowering and freeing. And if you're successfully operating here, you're in the minority, to be honest. Most organizations that I work with, they don't understand how to do this. Usually also, there's like this other interesting kind of corollary. Most of the teams that are working really well here have really solid hiring process. That means the people they invite into their organization are people who already align with the things they believe, right? So they're just creating momentum around that alignment. Those hiring processes tend to be focused on understanding the values of potential candidates instead of just hiring people that we like. Okay. So what I would love to do is, well, first, I'll just say this. In a perfect world, I think design system teams would primarily operate in the bottom left and the top right of this diagram. That gives them a really strong tactical approach to solving the common problems and the cultural alignment needed to do cohesive and efficient work on the most unique interfaces. Said in another way, common interface problems are best solved with assets, and product-specific interface problems are best solved with a strong culture. So now I'd love to hop over to the Fig Jam because I want to give you all an opportunity just to drop a sticky note on this holistic values quadrant. I want you to tell me where you are primarily operating. So here's that diagram. Hop in here, drop a sticky note, or you can use your voting if you want by pressing the E key and getting that little stamp tool up. But show me where you're at. Show me where your team is primarily focused. I'll give just a moment for you to answer there. Okay, a lot of folks in that bottom left, which I think is great. Like that's oftentimes I think where teams get started. Okay, I'll let you all continue to answer there, and let me hop back over to the presentation while you do so. So I wanted to just sort of wrap up this section with a reference to Zero Height, who just released their design system report for 2025. I had a chance to sort of read through this over the last few days, and one of the things that really stuck out to me in reviewing it is that so many of the challenges that most teams indicated they're facing are really strategic in nature. You can see on the left side, look at all these challenges: aligning with company goals, changes in the org, making time to focus on strategy, a culture of resistance. And none of these have anything to do with the tactical stuff, right? This is all strategic, like cultural work. And it just makes me think over and over when I see this stuff that architecting perfect tokens and designing perfect components and engineering the perfect patterns, none of that is enough. If you're not doing the strategic work that's needed for a sustainable system, you just might be making the wrong thing. Okay, so let me shift into this idea that we made the right thing, but there's something else going on. So the first thing that comes to mind is that you're never going to see value if teams aren't using it, right? So let's talk a little bit about adoption. In episode 9, we actually dug into this very specifically, and we asked, are you confidently tracking the adoption of your design system? If you answered yes, tell us how. If you answered no, tell us why. And so when we unpacked that data, you can see from this graph that about a third of the respondents said they were confident in their tracking, and not surprisingly, almost half said they weren't. Now, we got a lot of fun answers to this one. This person answered that they were confident in their adoption metrics, and they explained how they track it. They said, we send out surveys quarterly. We ask for the percentage of the product using the system versus the percentage of the product that could use the system. We then math that out to assign an adoption percentage. Okay, that's cool. I like that. Here was another actually pretty different approach. They said, we track office hours attendance, code adoption, token patches added, and Slack channel support requests. I remember reading this one and thinking, wow, that's kind of a different perspective. The implication with this answer is that adoption of the system is much, much more than just, is a component showing up in the code of production or not, right? So for this team, attending office hours is a form of adoption. Slack channel support requests are a form of adoption. I love that broadening of the definition. And this person said they weren't confident in their metrics, and they explained why. They said, we use some scripts to detect use. On paper, it looks good, but adoption doesn't equal conformance. So it can paint an inaccurate picture. And there were lots of answers like this. The community was clearly saying, just because someone is using the system does not guarantee that we'll see the intended impact. There's more to it than that. And this idea got us in that deep dive chatting about how adoption is so very nuanced. So after the deep dive, I started thinking more about this in an effort to really broaden my own understanding of what it means to adopt a design system. And here's just a few behaviors that I think we should actually start to qualify as adoption. Of course, using the tokens, of course, using the design components. Those are like basic, right? But also prototyping with the system. Maybe there's a team of UX folks that want to just experiment a little bit. What about just straight up adhering to the principles? Well, I mean, that's a form of adoption, right? What about following the processes or speaking the language of the system? All of those, I think, and there's many, many other things that we could also define as adoption. We also talked about this idea that we need a separation between the ways a team can adopt a system and the health of each of those ways. And so we kind of made this list of the ways that which adoption could be measured in terms of health. So when you say that somebody's using tokens, well, in which part of the product are they using them? Throughout or only in one portion? What version of those are they using, or what version of the components are they using? Are they 2 or 3 back and not updating? Are they doing it with some variation? Are they detaching? Are they extending these components? And which individuals? You know, when you say a part of the product or a team, well, we need to know individually, are these folks all on board, right? So there's a lot of nuance we can kind of separate out between these. It's been really helpful to have this perspective in the coaching work I'm doing, because it's allowed me to guide some of these teams to measure these things in a much more meaningful way. And another fun thing about the question and about the design system community as a whole is that people have some really good ideas about ways to tackle the problems that we ask about. Many responses shared they had great success in the adoption of their system by attaching adoption to another mandate. Here's what one person shared about a rebrand they had. She said, when we went through the rebrand, it was critical to get teams on board with the design system. Otherwise, our launch would have been a failure. During this process, we had detailed spreadsheets, partnerships and workshops with teams, and regular catch-ups to measure who was using the system and what was needed to support them across platform to move over if they weren't. Our sales tactic for this process was use the design system and get the rebrand for free. And this ended up being incredibly powerful to get us where we needed to be. And this works with a lot of other mandates too. Rebrands, replatforms, accessibility, sustainability, all of these can be enabled by a design system. Another idea that surfaced was offering an adoption roadmap. Here's an example that somebody from the community shared. In this context, for the teams to start using the system, they needed to do some modernization on their product. So the first tier, the first level, was a non-adopter. And they said, this is somebody who's not using the system and they've not made any progress on modernizing their product. The second tier was this plan and dependency tier. And this is a part of this is a consuming team who has done the modernization work and they have some plan to use the system in the near future. Then they had a visual style tier. This is a team who's using the color, type, icons, layout, all that kind of stuff in both design and development. So maybe they're using the foundational pieces, but not more complex components. Then they had a base component layer. These are folks using the basic components and doing some amount of contribution back to the system. And then they had this final layer, the complete and the complete tier. And this is using all the suitable components for their product and some cadence of regular contribution. This is so valuable because it's really speaking the language of a product owner. And product owners are the gatekeepers to adoption. These are the folks who prioritize work for their product teams. If you want to get the design system into their roadmaps, you got to show them what the path of adoption looks like. And the big takeaway for this question for me was we have to make it easy to adopt. Attaching to a mandate does this by giving folks a really clear solution to a very real problem. A roadmap does this by giving teams a clear set of steps to follow to become adopters, and both of those make it easy to adopt. Let's look at this idea one other way very quickly. So if we think about this, we put ourselves in the seat of a team that's interested in using the design system. I'm just going to give you this quick graph to show you kind of what that journey is like for those folks. We've got on this x-axis, we're mapping out excitement at the top to frustration at the bottom. And then we are just plotting this out over time. And so early in stage 2 of your design systems maturity, and actually, Katie, if you're there, would you drop a link to that maturity model assessment in the chat for folks? Because I'm sort of assuming folks know what I'm talking about when I say stage 2. If you don't know about the maturity model, you can take this little assessment. It'll help you see where you are. So Katie will drop that in the chat for you. Thank you, Katie. Anyway, early in stage 2 of your design systems maturity, this is going to be what the adoption journey usually looks like for a new subscriber. Right? So they start out with a ton of excitement, right? There's all these promises your system is making. But there's a very quick and deep dive into what I'm just calling the trough of frustration. All right, and that's when they see just how much work it is to shift the way they think, their processes, everything has to change about the way they work. And it actually takes quite a bit of time to dig out of that frustration and back up into excitement. Now, when a system matures in a healthy way through stage 2, the adoption journey of a new subscriber towards the end of that stage looks very different. Well, not very different, a little different. So this is kind of how I map out the late stage 2 adoption journey. And it's really about, at the very beginning, being better about setting expectations, right? We've been through this a few times now by late stage 2. So we kind of know what this journey is going to look like. And we've started to do work to communicate more effectively about what that work is. So when they come to this, they're not coming with rose-colored glasses. They're coming with an understanding of the amount of work. Maybe we've also done a lot of that stuff we were just talking about to make it easy to adopt. So they have a nice set of steps they can follow. They have some simple ways to become users of the system. So we've made it easy. And this combination of things, lowering their expectations in a realistic way at the beginning and making it easier along the bottom of this, means that these folks are going to be happier sooner, right? They're going to cross over that threshold from frustration into excitement a little bit earlier in the process. A little bit of clarity and some forethought will really help in moving that starting point down and that trough of frustration up. So for episode 41, we asked this question, and it's very relevant here. How do people feel about using your design system? And we asked who's responsible for marketing the system and what is their skill set? And you can see here, when we asked this question, most folks were kind of in the middle on this one, right? Almost 50% were like, yeah, that's how they feel. I don't know. Yeah, okay, meh. Now, I don't know any design system teams that have full-time, somebody fully dedicated to marketing. But I do think there's a lot from sales and marketing that we can actually learn on system teams. And in this episode 41, we spent a good amount of time thinking about how we could take a traditional marketing funnel and take that as an approach to adoption. Here's kind of what we described. Let me walk you through the stages really quickly here. Awareness is about making potential consumers, anybody who might use your system, making them aware of your system and its value prop, right? So this is consistent visibility, building an internal community. Things like a doc site do this, open doors, demos. Maybe you've got a blog, you've got some video tutorials, all this kind of stuff, Slack channels, Teams channels, all of that stuff that we do, newsletters, all of it. And the idea is just to be top of mind for these folks, right? When we move on to assessment, this is an idea that's like, I don't want to go in with the assumption that you are going to use the system. What I want is for you to be aware, and I want you then to assess whether what we are offering you is valuable. So what we want to do here is just give them everything they need to evaluate whether the design system is actually going to solve problems for them. So this is where we give them things like hands-on experience. Maybe you're offering test drive sessions where a team can come in and work alongside somebody from the system to build something together. Maybe you've got like a code sandbox or similar kind of pre-configured environments. This could be running workshops where they can migrate a simple feature to use the system, all kinds of stuff like this, right? Address their concerns. As you're getting questions, make sure you're documenting the answers you provide. And then enabling that technical evaluation. And I don't just mean code-based technical. I mean, like, how do I actually use all these complex components with all these props in Figma, right? Like there's some education that has to happen there too. So what we're doing is giving them everything they need to be able to make their own decision about using the system. And if we do all of that well, we get into this adoption part of the funnel. And that's basically, to use a marketing term, we're converting their interest into an actual implementation, right? So here we want to offer direct support. We got to enable that implementation in some way. And of course, we want to measure and show success. Now, there's a ton of possible activities across all of these layers. I'm definitely not saying that you have to do all of those things, okay? So please don't get overwhelmed. But what I think you should do is look around your org, right? You need to look around and figure out, how do we do these kinds of activities in this culture? So what are the kinds of things that I would do that would raise awareness here, that makes sense for my company? What would I need to provide them so they can make an honest assessment? And then how do I support them through the adoption? Now, I hear often folks blaming their lack of adoption on the fact that their leadership won't require teams to use the design system. I understand why people want this, and I'm definitely not saying that you shouldn't go look for that kind of a mandate. But a mandate alone is not going to solve your adoption problems. You're actually much better off to focus on engaging with consumers and solving real problems. Ideally, the design system is something they can't imagine doing their job without. Now, this top-down philosophy applies to adoption for sure, But this can also apply to our posture when consuming teams need to break the mold of the design system in some way. Here's one other challenge that can create problems for you, even if you've built all the right things. As practitioners, we're seen as controlling instead of enabling. I was doing some research with some design system subscribers, and in one interview, something came up where we were talking about design system open doors, and I was, just like that regularly scheduled video call, right, where anybody can drop in, talk to the system team, that kind of thing. Um, when I asked this person, somebody who was working, who was not someone who was working on the system, but someone who was a consumer of it every day, I asked him, "Do you ever attend those open doors? What that your team's hosting these things? Do you ever go?" And here's what they told me. They said, no, they don't really listen. They are there to defend the system, not hear how it could be better. Ooh, gosh, I hate this. This like really hit me. Um, we build our walls so high, and we do that with such good intent. We're defending the standard of excellence, right? In another conversation I was having with a design system lead, she expressed a concern that is similar. She said, we set the bar too high. Our subscribers are afraid to contribute, afraid to reach out because the governance is so strong that nothing they do will ever be good enough. So they give up. And here's the thing. You can't force adoption, just like you can't force consistency, at least not in a healthy and sustainable way. Instead, we have to get away from the idea that we are constraining what's possible. We have to recognize our place in the life cycle of a healthy product org. There are seasons of innovation and there are seasons of standardization. If all we did was standardize, our products would stagnate. If all we did was innovate, we actually wouldn't have much of a product at all. Too much of one prevents the other, and you can't fight the swing of the pendulum. And this is a challenge, right? Like, when do we enable? When do we constrain? When do we collaborate? When do we control? When do we invent? And when do we curate? Another quick story. I'm reading this book called Notes on Complexity. It's by a guy named Neil Thies. And in it, he explains how ants are always laying down a scent trail. As they leave a colony, they leave a scent so they can find their way home. And if they find some food, they collect it and they follow that scent trail back. And when they do that, they're laying down a different scent that indicates that there's food to go gather. So as other ants are crossing their path, they get that scent and they follow it to the food, and then they lay down their own scent trails. And all of this work reinforces the path. You've probably seen this happening on the sidewalk. This all seems simple and wonderful, but he continues. He says, there are always a small number of ants that aren't following the direct pheromone-based food line. These divergent ants, I love that term, divergent ants, are not lazy or pointless. They are, in fact, vital for adaptation. If all the ants were following the food line, there would not be ants left to find new food sources. And I found this fascinating. Some degree of randomness is kind of baked into the survival of an ant colony. And when I think about that in our context, it reminds me to take a different posture, to be okay with product teams breaking the norms. Out past what our design systems provide is where the innovation happens. Breaking the rules is a necessity, not always something to fight. And when a consuming team does that, and you look for the good that it brings, the pendulum can swing back. So let's adjust our posture. And remember, it's not always our job to constrain, but to enable. Now, I just want to wrap up with one last little part of this conversation. When I sat down to prepare for this, I found myself, I think, probably face to face with a problem that you all consider every day, which is, how do we create real impact with our work? That's what I want to do. And what I've learned in the last year about systems is that the most valuable part of a design system is the language that it gives us. And that's because language shapes culture. To help you understand, I want to read just one more excerpt from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She has this chapter that's called Learning the Grammar of Animacy. And in it, she tells the story of learning the language of her people, because she grew up speaking English. And when she started to learn her native language, Potawatomi, there were only 9 people remaining who were fluent. Her sister had given her a dictionary so she could start to kind of study the language and the words. And she shares just how frustrating this was. I guess English and Potawatomi are pretty different. So one day, as she's studying, she says she was feeling that it was simply too hard. She said, "The threads in my brain knotted, and the harder I tried, the tighter they became. The pages blurred, and my eyes settled on a verb whose meaning was to be a Saturday." I threw the book down. Since when is Saturday a verb? Everyone knows it's a noun. I grabbed the dictionary and I flipped more pages, and all kinds of things seemed to be verbs. To be a hill, to be red, to be a long, sandy stretch of beach, to be a bay. To be a bay? That's ridiculous. There's no need to make it so complicated. And she goes on and on, explaining her frustration, but then finally comes to a moment of understanding. In that moment, I could smell the water of the bay, watch it rock against the shore, and hear it sift onto the sand. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When a bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores, and contained by the word. But the verb in Potawatomi, wikwigama, to be a bay, holds the wonder that for this moment, that living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores. Because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall. And there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday. All are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive: water, land, and even a day. The language a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world, the life that pulses through all things, through the pines and the nuthatches and the mushrooms. This is the language I hear in the woods. And I'm reading this passage, and it takes me back to that moment that I had over a decade ago in Muir Woods, to the recognition that we, just like these redwoods, need each other to stay standing, to hold each other up. And that is the intent of the question. That's the intent of this conversation today. Nothing more, nothing less. But it also helped me to see that the language we speak frames our entire perception of the world around us. Where English sees humanity as the peak of the world, the Potawatomi see nature as an equal to humanity. Both of these worldviews are created and sustained by the languages we speak. Language shapes culture. And the work of design systems is culture work. It doesn't matter how amazing your components are, how perfectly you've crafted your tokens. What matters is what people want to do with them. You can have influence over that, but it doesn't happen in Figma or React. It happens in the language you define. As design system practitioners, you hold a precious power in curating and guarding that language to shape the culture of your digital products. And I hope today and the question and all the other sessions we have together remind you that you don't have to do that on your own. All right. Thank you so much for listening.